You guys may be aware that Matt and I are building a vehicle for onX Offroad, and it's going to be in a competition to see who can build the best vehicle to be on Ultimate Adventure. If you guys are unsure about that video, make sure you check this one out after you guys see this, and that'll kind of explain all the rules and what we got going on. All right guys, today we're going to talk about the elephant in the room, and that is this poo-poo. And a lot of you mentioned in the comments, get to the vacuum actuator to make the four-wheel drive work. And unfortunately, that actuator is sitting underneath the battery and the battery tray down in here where you can't even get your hand in there. I mean, I can't even get my hand to touch it. And here are my solutions. We listened to Fred.
I mean, I would love a 60 and a 14 bolt.
We actually knew that this was going to be an issue. We know that the IFS is just not strong enough. If you were to build IFS and you want it to be as strong enough as a solid axle, you're going to be like Lauren Healy or Von Gittin Jr., and you're going to have 6 figures tied up into that front end. Otherwise, this is still currently the strongest way to go. Behind me here, I got a Ford high pinion Dana 60, and I also picked up a GM 14 bolt for the rear. And I got these axles on a good deal, and let me explain to you how. This axle here actually came out of a Ford pickup that was in a fire. That's what you call a fire tire. This thing got milted, the truck was in bad shape, the owner just wanted to get rid of it. I picked up the entire truck for 800 bucks. You can even see here where all the grease just boiled right out of the tube. The best part about it is I didn't know if it had a 60 or a Dana 44 up front. It had a Dana 60. I was able to scrap the rest of the truck for 300 bucks. So I have my Kingpin axle here for $500. Now this is one of those deals that you don't always come across, but if you shop around, you find the right farmer, the right rancher, a person that maybe just isn't into off-roading, that you can find these deals. Now this thing has its pros and cons. Because it was in a fire, everything here is in bad shape. I'm gonna have to replace bearings, seals, the whole kit and caboodle, all the way across the board. Even the lockout hub melted out of this thing. On top of the fact that I'm not even 100% sure the condition of the axle tubes. As you can see here where the metal yard just sheared the leaf springs off, so that isn't melted metal. It'd probably been easier for me to find a Super Duty axle or a low pinion GM axle, but I wanted to do these axles because this is what you'd put in if you were building a Jeep. You're probably gonna do a driver drop high pinion front and then like a 14 bolt or a Sterling in the rear. So that's what we're gonna do today, is we're gonna do gears, locker, axle shafts, seals, bearings, all the stuff that you would need to rebuild an axle. We're gonna do it today here, and I'm gonna show you what it takes, what it costs, and how to build it as budget friendly as possible while still being functional for road use and Ultimate Adventure. My dad got this engine hoist from Harbor Freight when they first came out with engine hoists, if you can't tell how old that thing is. And I still have it to this day. It leaks, but it does still work. And I'm probably due for a new one. I know that I am. This thing got so hot when it was in its fire, I can't even turn the axle. Like, I can't even just turn the wheel. Look at that kingpin. Look at how much movement there is. That kingpin's totally shot, which means everything is bad. Everything got melted. I'm sure that this stuff here that's melted right there is probably some of the Teflon and nylon and whatever that's in there. This is going to be a little bit of a chore. From what I can tell, of course, it's just my ichrometer, but it looks straight. The tubing looks straight, so that's a plus. First order of business on this 60 is stripping it down. Oh, I'm gonna break that. All right, so I've always ran WD and it's worked really well for me, but you guys were suggesting try Freeall. So I'm gonna try that to try to get this bolt loose, and we'll see how it works. I made a mess. This stuff's got some pressure behind it. Ooh. All right, let's give it a shot here. Oh, dude. Nice. That worked pretty good. Ooh, yuck. This is the plastic that's melted to the shape of the lockout. It should just be a spring. That thing stinks. Like, I don't know if there's an explanation for like burnt metal, plastic grease, rubber, fire cooked old McNastiness, but if you can imagine that smell, that's what it smells like, with a hint of poo-poo. Yep, hint of poo-poo. And I don't know why, but that just reminded me of the only German I know, and that's the word for constipation. It's far from pooping. Yep. I don't know if you guys can see that, but that's not the rubber boot. That's the actual piston cylinder, and it just looks warped because it melted that hot. Woohoo! Huh. Oh, yeah. Oh, look at that. Bearings. Think that's still good? Alright, threw my hoodie on. It got a little cold in the garage. All I did was take these bolts out. I left the top bolt here so the cover doesn't come off. But just take these bolts out. The burnt, nasty gear oil smell that I can already smell is bad. And I got a bad sniffer, so I'm kind of nervous to pop this cover off. But we got to do it. Oh, that's water. And gray oil. And yeah, that stinks. Oh, look at that. Look at that. I don't even know what that is. It's like somebody took a poopy in here. Alright. Think those gears are good? There we go. Ew. That is a lot of fiery goo. Wow. Now here's an old school trick for all you cheapos out there. This is something that I used to do myself. A front diff cover is always thicker than the rear. So if you're running Dana 44s front and back, or maybe you have a rear Dana 60, go to the junkyard, find a front cover, and then you can swap that to the back and you have a much thicker rear cover. Oh yeah. It's bleeding. Owie. So these caps are machined to this case, so you want to make sure that you take them on and off the same direction that they came in factory. Okay, so this is a trick I've shown you guys before. When you're getting ready to take your caps off, make sure you mark them. So what I like to do is just take my punch, make a couple punches at the top of this one, you know, going sideways. Okay, that's got 2 dots. I'll do 2 dots here, and then I'll just do 1 dot and 1 dot here. This has got to be up in the top 2 of the worst differential smells I've ever had. Ooh, man, that is nasty. For my next trick, it's to how to pull this carrier out. A lot of people struggle to get these in and out. If you just take the wrench that's the size of the ring gear bolt here, put it up against the side of the case, and then you can just pry against it real easy, and the case will come right out. There we go. This, I see so many people struggle with this, and it was that easy. Super easy to come out when you do it this way. Inside this axle tube, right where this burnt axle seal is, look at that. And that's this whole tube all the way down. Gross. You guys want a little bit? It seems like most battery-powered tools are outdoing air tools anymore, but I have yet to find a good chisel like this. I mean, this air hammer is where it's at, and I have yet to find one that can match that in battery-powered form. Or is there even one? I don't know. But if there is, and you guys know about it, let me know, because I'd be interested to try it out. So one of the things I showed you guys when I was at Robbie Layton's and I did the gears on Hillbilly's Bronco is this spot right here. There's an oil catch right here to get oil up into your pinion bearing. And this thing, I can stick my finger in there. I don't know if you can see that. People always forget to clean that section out. And if you got this thing apart and you're tearing out all the bearings and changing everything out, make sure you clean this little catch out. This is where going cheap or having the local dude with the garage doing your gears will mess them up. Because if you have a broken tooth or broken metal or anything bad in that, that's just going to ruin them right away. Now this stuff's working really good to get that sludgy junk out. So I've made a concoction using both of these, and it actually got this thing pretty clean. Plus it makes it not smell so bad. Now it kind of smells like, I don't know, like oil-based mud. If any of you guys have ever worked on a drilling rig, it smells like oil-based mud with just a little bit of lime in there. It smells pretty good. Another thing people forget to do is check your breather. I don't see a hole through there. So if that's plugged, when we put new axle seals in, what that's going to do is blow your axle seals out. So we want to make sure that your breather's clean as well. That's not good. Okay, moment of truth. If you guys have ever taken a kingpin apart, you know that this pin goes in right there. That's how big those threads are. A lot of times you got to put fire to it. I'm hoping that this socket will survive, and I'm hoping that this 1/2 inch is good enough to do it. Fire! It's getting it! DeWalt for the win! We win. More fire, more hammer, more tools. But I'm gonna run this over to the car wash. I'm gonna pressure wash this thing out and all this stuff. So now that we got the axle all cleaned up, before I go ahead and start with my gear install, I want to go ahead and weld up the cast to the tubing. These tubes are pressed in, and then they just put these little spot welds in here, and that's really just not a whole lot. And because I'm going to wheel it hard, I want to make sure that I have all of this welded up good. So the old school method of thought when you're welding cast to your regular steel is that you have to heat it up, and then you weld it, and then you have to peen it, is what it's called. P-E-E-N. Yeah, P-E-E-N. Yeah, so peen, I want to make sure I said that right. So the peening it, you sit there and tap it, and you tap it, tap it, tap it, tap it, hit it with a hammer, and you're basically dispersing the heat because cast will just hold the heat in the same place. But then I had another old timer one time tell me, hey, you know what? I just heat it back up again. And I was like, well, that's dumb. Why did I never think of that? That makes sense. So that's how I've done it for the last quite a few years now. So what I want to do though is I still want to heat this up, and then I want to weld it together, and then I want to heat the cast up again, and then I'm going to wrap it up, and then I may just call it a night, because you want to let it cool slowly is the biggest key to these, is let it cool slowly, but let this heat be dispersed through the cast so that it doesn't crack. important part with wrapping this up then is allowing it to cool slowly. And that way, we're gonna have perfectly good looking welds. They're not gonna crack, and it's gonna add all that strength to what we already have. Oh, my brain wasn't working right because it was all smoky in here, but this is just a fiberglass welding blanket that you can get from Harbor Freight. That's what this one is. And it keeps that heat in nice. I mean, this is warm, but I can put my hand on it. And it's scalding hot metal underneath. I have a smoky mess. It's dark out. What I thought would take me a few hours took me all day. I'm gonna let this thing cool off tonight, and I'll see you guys right after this. All right, so it's a new day. The garage is cleaned up, and I got something to show you guys. So this is why I preach in every axle build video that I do, that it's important to shop around for your junkyard axles, because you're gonna spend money building it. And that's the reality. And in this case, that's exactly what we're gonna do. I got a new ring and pinion, we got a new locker, we got new outer axle shafts, new lockouts, kingpin rebuilds, U-joints, diff cover, and other things. And basically what this accumulates to is almost $3,200 worth of parts that we're gonna be throwing into this axle. Now here's the best part. If you guys are an onX Elite member, you're gonna get a 15% discount on your Yukon parts. So now what is almost $3,200 is $2,700. I mean, that's I literally have almost a $500 in savings here. So there's other companies that we're gonna be building with that are gonna have these discount codes that are gonna allow us to build this thing on as much of a budget as you can do. So like these 35 spline outer axle shafts, for instance, I could have done alloy axles, inner and outer with super joints, but then that's just that much more money. What instead I'm gonna do is the Dana Spicer heavy duty 1480 joint with a 35 spline outer. Dana 60s are notorious for coming with 30 spline outers, and that's just not strong enough. They're gonna break. So when you get a master install kit, it comes with new axle seals, new bearings, new shims. When you get your ring and pinion out, they're usually covered in some sort of oil, some sort of mescaline or something. And you want to basically go ahead and clean them up with some brake clean. And that way you can dry them out. So when you go ahead and run your ring gear pattern, you know that your pattern's going to be good and it won't get messed up by any of that stuff in there. On top of the fact, you want to clean the back of the ring gear and your locker to make sure that you have a good seated seal when you bolt that up. And I'm going with no other than a Yukon Grizzly locker for the front. Red Loctite is a must for your ring gear bolts. Ooh, that was a lot. I used a very small 3/8 impact on a light setting just to get the bolts set. Now I have to torque all these at 110 foot-pounds, and you want to do it in a crisscross pattern so that you're equalizing the torque all the way around. Okay. So here's a trick to torquing up your ring gear bolts. You take your 35 spline shaft and then you set it in there. You can get a better jaw bite on it. And then you can come up here and you can just torque your ring gear bolts if your vise is tight. That's simple. So what I'm going to do here now is pull the bearing off and make sure there's no shims underneath the bearing. Obviously there's an oil seal there that I want to put back on my new pinion, and I want to make sure that there's no shims under here, because basically I can take the old shims, measure those, use my new shims to get a good starting point of pinion depth. Now one of the things that people always say to me when I'm doing these videos is, where is your crush sleeve? Well, a crush sleeve goes right here, and that basically sets your preload for your bearings on each end. In this case, this Dana 60 runs shims. So that shim sits here, and this actually sits on the face of this bearing when you have it down, and that's what sets the preload of your bearings once you've set your pinion depth. I hope that makes sense. If your axle does require a crush sleeve and it had one in it, you don't want to use the new supplied pinion nut. You always want to use your old pinion nut when you go to set it in. So the best way to pull your bearings off is with a pinion bearing puller, but you actually want to use that pinion bearing puller on your locker or your case as well. It's the safest way not to destroy your bearing. So basically the way this thing works is you set it down on top of the bearing with the race on it. You have a clamshell here that holds that, you want to adjust your clamshell up so it's nice and tight. And then you just got to cover the clamshell so it doesn't separate and tighten that down. You can also get these tools from Randy's Worldwide if you don't have one. I actually keep a dedicated wrench and a dedicated socket to this tool just because I've had them for a while, and it makes it a lot easier instead of having to hunt down the tool I need. So it's that easy. Now we have the bearing free, and now I can double check and make sure there's no shims other than this oil sling shim that's here. And it looks like that is literally the only shim on this disgustingly stinky bearing set. So here's my old pinion, here's my new pinion. Now the higher numerically the number, the lower your gear ratio is. So these are probably 410s, I'm just guessing, I didn't actually count it. And these are 513s, so you can see that the pinion's actually smaller. That doesn't always mean it's weaker, it just means that it's a little smaller because you're gonna run less teeth here and a thicker ring gear, more teeth on your ring gear. If you're unsure what your gear ratio is, you can always take your ring gear, count all your teeth, count all your pinion teeth, divide it by that, and then that'll tell you your gear ratio. So if I were to count all these, divide it by here, I'm going to get 513 gears. So the next tool in our arsenal is a dial caliper. And these are just basically must-need tools when you're going to do ring and pinions. Before I press the bearing onto this pinion, we have to match this oil sling. Now this oil sling is actually in really good shape. And what this works for is basically because you have a high pinion axle, this is going to keep the oil up in your pinion bearings. This is going to help a lot. So you definitely want to make sure you reuse it. So in this case, this one is 33 thousandths. This new one is 31 thousandths. So I just lost 2 thousandths of pinion depth. I don't really think I'll notice that too much. Usually it's a 5 to 10 thousandths jump is what you need to do when you do stuff. But let's go ahead and press this on. So I'm going to go ahead and spray this thing with a little WD-40. And then we can press it on. If you guys have ever seen these are the Swag dimple dies. They actually work really good for doing a press because they're already designed to handle that weight. So the next thing we're going to need is a race driver, and I got to set this race in the cast housing. I got to press it in there with just a hammer and the race driver. But it had these behind it. It actually had this old one that I kind of got a little crazy with, but I checked them. They're both the exact same thickness, which is nice. So that's another oil holding protection. And then I just got to match these shims, or I could technically just reuse these shims if I wanted to. They're in good shape. And put it in here and drive that race in. And that'll set our pinion depth for a starting point. So now that we got our race in with the shims, that is basically what will set our pinion depth. So if we need to bring it in more, I'll have to actually remove that race and put more shims in. Or if I need to pull it back, I'll have to remove the race and pull some shims out. And this is why this takes so long to do gears, and this is why it costs so much money, because it's a lot of specialty tools and a lot of time. You also got to drive your race in for the top. Also, don't forget to add gear oil to your bearings. And what that's going to do is make sure that everything spins the way it should, spin freely, and give you the correct torque specs that you need. So because this bearing has to actually press onto the pinion itself, I can't get enough yoke on there to get that. But that's why there's this nice little dent in the middle of this pinion. I also do suggest always using the old pinion nut all the way up until final install. So I tighten this up and immediately I can't get this yoke to turn, which means that those little shims that are right here on top of the pinion that separate these two bearings is just too tight. I'm gonna have to add more shim right there. So even though I had a good starting point, that's just not enough shim. So I just threw in about another 20 thousandths of shim. We'll see if that's enough. I probably need to take 5 out, but it's tight. I can't get any play on it. I'm gonna go ahead and just make sure that the races are seated good. One of the things I want to mention real quick, just to remember in your head, is that now I have shims here to set the bearing separation, and I have shims here to set the pinion depth. And so if I have to adjust this pinion depth, if I have to make it go in deeper, I have to add shims here. Then I have to actually add shims up here too to keep that same amount of distance between the two bearings. Next part of this conundrum is removing these bearings and getting the shims off of here and finding how many shims we want on each side. So when you want to make sure that when you pull this side off, you get that shim depth, you set it on here, press the bearing on, get this shim depth, set it there, press that bearing on. This is pretty simple as long as you got the tools. So the trick for this one, because you don't have a pinion here, is you create a pinion. It's that simple. I just pulled that bearing and I got, I got that nasty burnt gear oil, plastic rubber, death poo-poo smell. Ugh. All right, so now that we match the shims with the bearings here, that's going to give us our best starting point for not only the width of the case of the 60, but hopefully side-to-side action with the pinion. We'll find out. This is the point where I want to make sure that my double dots match. So there's my double dots there. There's my double dots there. So I can immediately tell that there's just a little too much shim in this carrier because I can still move the pinion. It feels like I have pretty close to the right amount of backlash, but I cannot barely move this carrier, which means that the pressure on it is just too tight. So I think I'll pull it out of this side because I still feel like that's more than about 10 thousandths. And so I'll pull it out of this side, which will bring this ring gear tighter to the pinion. That easy every time. This is the part where having some setup bearings would come in handy, which are basically this bearing, but you bored it out. I used to have a set, but I don't know where they ended up. And now I don't have a set. So, that being said, I can't just slide these bearings on and off to do this. Checking it off the pinion, I had about 20 thousandths of play, which means you would think that I would just pull 10 thousandths out and that would give me 10 thousandths backlash, but that's really not normally the case. So if you guys watched that video where I put in the gears for the Bronx Star for Robbie Layton and Hillbilly, I told Robbie he needed to get a bigger dead blow mallet, and he didn't. And that's why it was struggling to get this in. You really want one of these big fat ones. I don't even know the weight of this, but 56 ounce. You want a 56 ounce or bigger really to tap these in, and it makes your life a lot better. And now I can turn the ring gear. All right. Now it's time for the next specialty tool, which is a dial indicator and a good magnet. So what I'm going to do here is set this here, get it lined up where I can get onto the ring gear. And now what I want to do is turn the ring gear here. I'll hold the pinion and I want to turn this ring gear and just see what it has for backlash. All right, so I got right at about 8 thousandths of backlash. For a Dana 60, you want 6 to 10, and I would always steer towards 10. So if you get like right at 6, I would probably add a shim, and even if you get 11 thousandths backlash, I would be happier with that 11 thousandths than the 6 thousandths personally. So now we've done all of this work, and now we can just run our very first pattern and see where we're at. And then we get to adjust everything after that. So that locker came with the perfect, what is that called? A paint, like a paint lock or whatever. You put your little paint dabs on here. I can't remember what it's called. This is some leftover marking compound I had from the last gear set I did. And that's what I'm going to use today. Biggest thing with this stuff is it's almost like anti-seize. It gets everywhere. And it comes really, really thick. So you always want to thin it out with a little oil. Because if it's really chunky, it's not going to give you a very good pattern. I like to do about 4 teeth, 4 to 5 teeths, enough where you can really see what your pattern is going to look like. And the way I like to do that is just by putting a socket in on a drill so I can spin it nice and smooth. Let's take a look at our pattern. Ideally, what you want is a centered oval pattern that basically shapes in an oval shape right in the middle of your ring gear. And your coast side is secondary to your drive side. So you got to pay attention if you have a high pinion or low pinion, which way it spins. The coast side basically is what's going to create your ring gear noise. So like if you have a coast side and the coast side doesn't look good, but your drive side looks good, you may have a howl when you're off the throttle, kind of that woo woo woo, like you get with a super swamper or something. You may get that with your ring gear if you have a bad coast side. We got pretty lucky here. Sometimes you end up having to redo this a bunch. Sometimes it's way off. The pattern's just way off. And it may have just been set up that way. But that's why I like to have a case that already has the gears in it, where I can kind of cheat a little bit and use those shim depths to kind of get it close. Like I said, the carrier was wider on this one, so I had to pull some out anyway at this point. But our pattern looks pretty good. Now I got to go back, tear this thing completely out, and set up the pinion. Let's set this thing up and then see what we can get for a final assembly. Plus, I still got to put the axle seals back in. So now that we've looked at our gear set, we know that the coast side looks really good. The drive side looks really good. I think I am going to go ahead and just add 5 thousandths to that pinion. And I'll put that in. I'll finalize the pinion because I feel like that's where it needs to be. So right here, we can see a really good shot of the pinion. And you can see where it makes contact here. And it could probably just come in just a little deeper, make just a little more contact in here. You want to get as much contact pattern as you can. So that's what we're going to do. Same with here. So basically, you can see that if it was just in just a little deeper, it'd make a little more contact there. It's going to probably make our coast side be the one that's just a little bit off. It's going to be a little deep, but then our drive side is going to be absolutely perfect. And this is a really good pattern. Like most people, you could probably run this and be just fine. I'm just kind of picky. So I'm going to add 5 thousandths here. The pinion was just a little loose. I mean, it was tight, but it wasn't, I could tell just because I've done it a lot, that it didn't have enough resistance there. So instead of adding a 5 thousandths into this shim as well, I'm going to leave that 5 thousandths out of that one and just put it here at the pinion to bring it in deeper, and it'll tighten up those 2 bearings. So I always like to set up the original setup with the brand new bearings just to see how well it sets up. If it sets up really good, then I know I may only have to remove the bearings once or twice and it'll go well. If the pattern is way off, let's say it's just way, way bad, then what I want to do is use my old bearings and make setup bearings is what it's called. And you just take in here and you die grind the inside of your bearing out, and then you can just slide it on and off my pinion here, and it just slides on and off. And then I would have a pinion setup bearing and case setup bearings that make it a lot easier to take this on and off. So I found a 4 thousandths or 2 3 thousandths that equaled to 6 thousandths pinion shims. So that's what I'm going to use. I'm just going to use the 6 thousandths. That should make it perfect. Now there's one more tool that I have in my arsenal here for these, and that is a race extractor, race driver basically. And this is so I can get that race out to put these last little shims in to get that pinion depth in. And basically this just sets up against the edge of the race without falling off. It's got a nice oval shape. You could probably make this if you wanted. And that way I can get this out to put in this extra shims. This is why setting up those shims is important, but this is what you would have to do if you were putting in your crush sleeve, is that's why you'd want to use your old nut to get that tight, to kind of set that resistance. And you want to do this without the carrier in. Also, I know it says 17 to 30 inch-pounds. I would try to steer on the lighter side of that, because realistically, if you have 30 inch-pounds of resistance here, when this thing gets hot and these bearings start to expand, that's going to get a lot tighter. So I would rather stay towards the lighter side of that, try to get that 17, realistically that 17 to 20 inch-pounds. Now that I've got this set, we know our pattern's good. Now I can pull this out one more time, and I got a oil sling shim in here that's going to go on this side of this bearing, and then we got our pinion seal that we'll go ahead and put on. And then I can put this all back together, and I can use the new nut this time, and we'll have the pinion part done. Now, one of the things I do like to do when I put a new seal in is go ahead and just take some red grease and wipe that seal before I put it in. I'm also going to put some on this yoke, and that way it just makes a really good contact, and it doesn't make sure that I don't tear or rip anything when I put it together. It can be a really, really, really thin layer. Some people say they like to put Loctite on this nut. This nut is already a locking nut, and what I've seen people do if they put Loctite on this nut is actually strip the threads out, because it gets so hot that it cooks it, and then you ruined your pinion. So I would rather just use this, and then I paint mark it, and then I check it after a little while. Now, one thing I can tell you is once you have this seal in, there's just a little bit more resistance there. So that's why you want to check it without the seal in and without the carrier, so you can get the good resistance pattern, so you know exactly what your inch-pounds resistance is on your bearings. If you're wondering how tight to make that pinion nut, it's called German tight, which is Guden tight. No different than doing my pinion bearing. Once I set these in, which basically these are designed so the axle shaft will slide up in there, but I'm going to go ahead and put some red grease in here as well, and that way it just keeps it good and lubricated until I actually can put torque to it and break in the gears. I don't know if this is faster than just having somebody else here with a rod and just holding a socket here and then just hitting it in, because that's the way I've always done it. But this is a good way to do it by yourself. We can torque this up to 80 foot-pounds. Woohoo! Another thing to remember too, if you got a torque wrench, is go ahead and take the torque off it when you're not using it. That way it helps it stay calibrated. We're right at about 8-9 thousandths backlash. We want 6 to 10, so we're good there. I'm gonna go ahead and paint up another little bit. And that is what we want. We wanted a perfect drive side. Coast side is always secondary, so it still should sound good. It's still not gonna howl, but now we know that our drive side is perfect. I won't waste your time cleaning up those nasty inner axle shafts. I'll get those in, but I gotta rebuild these kingpins. And I have a few tricks for that.
Well, when she wrapped her loving arms around my neck on the dance floor at Chelsea's bar, I should have turned her away, but I was out of sync. I was firing.
All right, so I know it's smoky in here, but that's because I was working on this, so I'm gonna do the same to this one. The reason that I would prefer a ball joint 60 over a kingpin 60 if I'm gonna stick with stock knuckles is because the kingpin knuckles are really thin right here and here, and they're really prone to breaking in these points. So you either have to buy aftermarket knuckles or do something like I did. And it's because it's cast, I did the same thing I did with the axle housing. I had to torch it up, get it nice and cherry hot, and then I made plates here that welded onto here and over here to basically beef up the top of this kingpin knuckle, and hopefully that'll be the trick to save my day on a budget. All right, so day 3, and now these things have cooled off. I wrapped them up just like I did with the housing. They have 1/4-inch plates welded on all 3 sides. This is where these things are weak, and hopefully that will fix my issue. I've made double passes on everything, and now I just need to clean up the slag, and then I can paint them. Now I'm going to stick with my regular tie rod at its location, but my drag link I want to put on a high steer arm, and you can't have that without a high steer arm. So I got this one off eBay for $99.99. Here's the new Kingpin spring. Here's the old one. Tell me it didn't get a little warm. Wowza. So next thing we got to do on this axle is brakes. And I chose Rough Stuff. They make a nice brake caliper bracket kit that can run a Chevy 3/4 ton single piston caliper. Basically what that means is it takes less fluid to stop your brakes. That's what I run on my Samurai axles, my 1-ton axles, and that's how I'm able to stop those big axles and big tires with just those smaller calipers, because it takes less fluid to make that pressure point. And that Rough Stuff brake kit comes in for the Ford axle at $93.76, just under $100. Now what that kit doesn't come with, you can buy it with their calipers and brake rotors and everything else. But I decided to go a little different route. In the very beginning of this, we agreed that wearable items won't classify as cost deterrents. Basically, if we're driving and the water pump goes out, or the alternator goes out, or a spark plug wire goes bad, we're going to change that, because that can happen on any vehicle. That shouldn't be put into your build budget. One of the other things we agreed on was brakes. And so while I'm still paying for my brake brackets, I didn't go out and just go buy some fancy drilled and slotted rotors. I went with AutoZone because I want to show you guys that this is still a budget conscious build. The rules have gotten so combobulated for this whole thing. If you guys have seen the original onX video where they talk about the rules, you can really get fudgy with a lot of stuff. But one of the things that I'm not going to charge to this build, and we agreed to this, is the actual brakes. Because let's face it, brakes are something you should have. The fact that we didn't have only but one in the S10 going up Moab Rim is just not right. I didn't know that it was that bad until we got up there. But that's why you want to have good brakes. We're going to be doing some serious rock crawling with these things. Ultimate adventure is no joke. And I want to make sure that we can actually stop and do it correctly. If you are curious what these cost, these are $30 a piece for these calipers.
But we were both sad and lonely after what death had done. But like rattlesnakes kicked across the ground. Our true loves were dead, and our hearts were full of grief. I was firing, she was gasoline.
So the thing about a cast housing, it doesn't really matter if it's a Dana 60 or Dana 44 or 14 bolt or whatever. They're all just a little bit different depending on when they were cast, how they were cast, the cast models, all kinds of things that can variate the sizes. Just tweak it just a little bit. So basically, Yukon makes their cover big enough to cover every situation. So what I'm going to do is I put this on here, and I have just this much lip on the bottom side of my cover. And that lip is protruding below the cast housing. So I have this cover upside down. I'm going to shave this part off so that I have a smooth transition from the cover to the actual nodular housing of that Dana 60. So you can see the ridge here that's still quite a bit higher than the cast. And that's basically how the bottom end was. Now you can see how smooth the bottom end is. No hooky on no rocky. Yeah. I still got a few cleanup things that I want to do to this thing, but that's the gist of it. You guys got a good idea of how to do this front axle. On to this one, if you guys have been eyeballing this 14 bolt at all, this thing's already done. And no joke, this is a Facebook Marketplace score. The guy put it up for sale for $1,200. I'll put the ad right here. Then he went ahead and dropped it to $800. Now, it's middle of winter, and I was like, man, I don't know if I want to drive up to North Dakota to go get it. Then he dropped it to $600. So I actually had my buddy Roger go pick it up, who lives up there in North Dakota. He picked it up for me. I ran up there, grabbed it from him. He actually ended up buying a front axle, ultimately with a deal that he got, which I cannot share the deal that he got on that. But My price on this axle was now $500. So I got this axle for 500 bucks. Now I have not tore it apart yet. It potentially, you know, it's supposed to have 513 gears and an ARB. I haven't tore it apart, so I'm going to tear it apart. But if I come across anything weird, I'll let you guys know in the next video. Otherwise, I'm just going to run through it. I won't waste your time on that. As for steering and suspension, we may go to a Jeep for some of those parts. So if you guys don't mind, please make sure you check out the link below, go to the onX app, and vote for us, because we need you guys. Because this thing is going to have cool Jeep parts. It's going to have this high pinion 60, the 14 bolt, and those are things that you guys would do if you're getting into the hardcore wheeling anyway with a Jeep. So I hope you guys like this video. I'll see you guys next time. Check these out. Like and subscribe. See ya.
I was fire and she was gasoline.
Turtle shell.